Okay. Hello, Sam. How are you today?
Hey Clint, how you going?
I'm well,
Doing
thanks. So today we are going to be talking about ankle sprains, which is a I imagine, fairly broad topic. I've sprained my ankle many times and in many different ways. And so we're going to learn all about that, how to treat it, what it is, all that kind of stuff. And so I guess that sort of brings us into the first question. What is an ankle sprain and how does it occur?
It is very, very common, like you're saying. We've all probably gone over our ankle, at some point in our life, at least once. But an ankle sprain is basically if we look at the structures that are supporting the ankle, it's usually, and I have to probably take a step back and say that when we're talking about ankle sprains, the typical ankle sprain is going to be an inversion ankle sprain, or what we call a lateral ankle sprain. So where you sort of fall out onto your ankle rather than fall in onto your ankle. So the falling in on your ankle can happen, but usually the structures that are supporting the inside of the ankle, it's a very strong fibrous structure, and it's a lot harder to turn your ankle in than it is out.
As you were saying that, if you notice, I switched to the side. It was because I was sticking my leg out, and I had not noticed that until now. You are right. Yes.
Yeah.
So it's like, I'm going for a run or something like that. I step on an uneven surface. My foot will typically roll out to the side,
turn out,
as you say, using terminology, and then that just turns further than I guess the structure in the ankle can handle, and then that gives you a strain.
Exactly. So that's the traditional ankle sprain, is that lateral inversion one. The inner one can happen usually with a bit of trauma. So think of it like a football tackle gone wrong, where somebody falls over and you've got the body weight of that it can happen. But typically when we're talking about an ankle sprain today, at least we'll be talking more about the inversion.
Gotcha.
And so on the outside of the ankle there, so the connecting the bones and the ankle mortise together, we've got these fibrous structures, ligaments that are connecting bone to bone. And typically you've got three ligaments that fan across that ankle bone and connect to your foot. And in certain positions, namely plantar flexion, so when your foot's sort of pushing down and you're springing forward, so think of like in a position of a high heel, for example, that's where the ankle is pretty vulnerable and quite easy for it to go over and stress those structures. And so like you were saying, basically an ankle sprain is when those structures stretch more than they should or more than they can handle. And so they're typically three grades of ankle sprains. So grade one is where those structures might stretch a little bit. So you get like little tears, but not enough to really cause too much damage. A grade two would be where they tear a little bit more. So you get a tear, but they're still connected. And then a grade three sprain would be where you actually, and that's probably a real serious one, the grade three one, because you do lose a lot of structural and the integrity of the ankle is really compromised stability wise. The grade three one is where you get complete rupture, and that can be quite nasty, and it's often associated with some other things. One more thing I should say is that often when you have especially an ankle sprain where we're talking about the grade two, grade threes, and it can happen very quickly. And sometimes, your ankle doesn't just turn out where you get an ankle sprain. Sometimes your leg twists out as well. So think of maybe a footballer who's got his studs in the ground or her studs in the ground, and you go over your ankle, but there's a rotational element as well where your leg twists. That can affect the ligament that connects your leg bones together, which is your tibia and your fibula. And that's called a syndesmosis injury or a high ankle sprain. So it happens often in football, skiers, that sort of thing, typically where your foot's planted, but that can happen too.
Gotcha. So I guess you've answered another question I was going to have, is that are all ankle sprains the same? Because I think, I've sprained in different contexts and in different ways, but now that you've mentioned what you've mentioned, it is typically the same way. But you have mentioned a few different types of ankle sprains there. Are there any, and so obviously there are some differences, but you've spoken about the grades and the way the sprain can come about. Is there anything else that can distinguish one sprain from another that you haven't mentioned yet that's worth going over?
Yeah, so the physical signs, of course, are quite different in those ankle sprains. So not all ankle sprains are equal, and it really depends on how you've done it, the mechanism of the injury, and basically the way you fall and where the force goes. That's going to really dictate, what happens there. And so what differentiates usually is you can get a lot of physical signs, the manifestations of the ankle sprain, such as bruising. You can see a lot of swelling in different areas. That can tell us things about the type of injury that we've done. But also then we've got to start looking a bit further into, okay, well, we're talking about strictly ligaments here, where we're talking about bone on bone or bone connected to bone. But there's also muscles that go around those ligaments as well, which add some support. And in an ankle sprain, we have to then look further into, it could just be a ligament, or you could also have a tendon that's tried to, for example, a muscle that's tried to fire and prevent you from falling. And that tendon, which connects the muscle to the bone now, that can then pull off the bone, for example, and we get a little fracture in a bone, or we get a tear in a muscle as well. So sometimes it's purely a traditional ankle sprain, just a ligament, just a tweak. Other times we've got to look further and say, okay, well, it can affect the bone, can affect tendons and ligaments and joints and all that sort of stuff.
So I was going to say, as I'm listening to you, there's, it can be sort of turned outwards or turned inwards. And apart from that, it's primarily the degree of injury that separates one sprain from another.
In terms of, so the degree of injury in terms of the ligaments. But you can also have some associated damage where, like we were saying, if you
could be muscle as well.
Could be muscle, and it could be the articular surface of the ankle can also be damaged. If you imagine it's sort of bent in quite enough.
So you're referring to the bone here?
The bones, So the ankle bone, the top of the talus there, which sits in the, you've got this like a bone, and then you've got a mortise over the top. Now, if that sort of twists around, you can then get these chondral effects as well, where you can definitely, sometimes they're missed and they can be quite
What's a chondral effect
later on. So where you get some cartilage, the articular cartilage could wear, and the bone underneath the cartilage could wear or chip, or and then you can get floating bodies in an ankle, things like that. So they're not all equal, and they're not all graded just by I guess that's a takeaway message there. It's not just the ligament that can be damaged. We've got to look often for other things.
So here's a question for you.
Assessing.
What's the chance that you've damaged the bone without damaging the ligament?
Quite rare. Quite rare.
It is possible.
It's possible, depending on the mechanism of injury.
So we shouldn't assume. We certainly shouldn't assume a linear gradation where it's like slight muscle, slight tendon tear, serious tendon tear, tendon actually rupturing, then muscle, then bone. It's not like that. You can have different levels in different parts of your ankle as well, I imagine.
Yep. And it just depends how you've done it.
Yeah. So it's probably, I guess there's so many different ways your ankle could be injured that we don't actually have like 3 or 4 different categories or descriptions. It's really a case of which tendons have been damaged and how much, has bone been damaged and how much, has muscle been damaged and which ones and how much.
Exactly. And it really is important to sort of go through that history of the mechanism. How did it happen?
Yes.
How did your foot fall? What were you doing? What did you feel afterwards? Did you hear anything? Did you feel anything? All of that sort of stuff. And that will help paint that picture.
So and those questions are comprehensive. So the other question I was going to ask was, how do you know if you do need medical attention or, or imaging after a sprain? And like I said, I've had a number of sprains. I think only once do I remember being strapped up. And that's just because I was probably about 13 or 14 and I was away at a sports camp. And I guess it was a mix of the people running the camp wanting to make sure they took care of everybody's kids. And at the same time, I think the first aid officer was just keen to strap up somebody's ankle. They'd done all the training and they just wanted to use it. And that's probably the most comprehensive treatment I've ever received from an ankle sprain. Having said that, I've always felt like I would recover and it was painful and everything, but I was able to recover. Maybe I made a mistake, but I guess the question then is, a lot of people out there who probably have sprained their ankle, I thought, I'll be okay. It hurts, but I'll be okay. What have they possibly missed, or what should they be looking out for to determine if they should be seeking medical attention?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because like we're saying, there are so many forms that this can take. So you could just have a minor
which is a surprise to me. You've really surprised me. I was going to say you put me on the back foot, but people might have thought that was a dad joke. But it has really surprised me that it was
appreciate that one.
Yeah, that it was so diverse. So sorry, continue.
Yeah, so I guess the most obvious thing to trigger a visit to emergency or a visit to your GP or physio or podiatrist or whatever the case is, would be if you heard a pop, for example. So you felt a crunch, you heard a pop, you heard something like that would really indicate that you've done something that is more than just a simple tweak. Also then, and it might not happen immediately, but in the sort of probably in the next hour or so, next hour to 2 hours, if you're noticing some bruising, and that can often extend, bruising can extend into the foot even. It's not just around the ankle, it can extend up to your toes. It's pretty common for toes to appear swollen and bruised, that whole, along that whole lateral side of your foot. So swelling, bruising definitely would indicate that we've done more than just a tweak.
Gotcha. So that tells me that I should have seen the doctor early in some previous event when I didn't. And, and therefore I'm thinking there's probably a number of people watching this who have now thought, I should have seen a doctor. So from the sound, and I'm remembering this particular time when I did have bruising over my foot. It was quite painful when it happened. Is that a reasonably good indicator, the severity of the pain, as to whether you should see medical attention on it?
I think not just I think pain alone wouldn't just be enough, but it would be, are you having trouble weight bearing? So if you can't bear weight, that would be, because obviously.
And would that include limping?
Yeah, limping, and everyone's threshold of pain is a little bit different. So that's why we're saying, so if you haven't experienced pain before, say, you're a 12-year-old who's it's your first injury, you played football and you sprained your ankle, you could think that that's the worst sort of pain that you've ever experienced, and it is the worst pain you've experienced, so rightly so. But whether that's caused enough damage or not, we have to look for, can you bear weight on it? Can you stand on it? Do you fall? That sort of thing. And like I said, did we hear any popping or anything like that? And is there a sufficient swelling or bruising to indicate that we've done some damage there? All of those sort of things combined, especially if you can't bear weight, and especially if you can't bear weight throughout the next few hours after the injury, the next day after the injury, then that would indicate that, x-rays or some sort of imaging, not always an x-ray, but some sort of imaging might be required. That would probably warrant that. Whereas if you sort of tweak it and it's a little bit sore, there's no bruising, it could just be a minor sprain. That doesn't necessarily mean, rush off to emergency.
So if you, I should say, if, like, first of all, you got the I guess the haptic feedback, which is the pain you feel. If that's pretty high, it's worth doing it. But at the same time, if your visual or your auditory senses are stimulated, either through seeing swelling or you actually heard the sprain, that's a pretty good indication you should go and get some medical attention.
Definitely.
And of course, there's no harm in getting attention when it turns out you didn't need it. But the dead opposite can be quite problematic. So it's, so people, here's a question for you. Do you think people need to maybe take ankle injury a bit more seriously than they do?
I think if they can't weight bear, absolutely. And if they're swelling, and that, I guess what we're talking about here is in the acute phase. So that is, the aftermath of the injury. There's another part to this where if something isn't responding as well as you thought, or if you're getting, maybe 3 weeks down, typically a grade 1 or grade 2 ankle sprain, between in the first 1 to 4 weeks, we should be seeing a good improvement. So you shouldn't be on crutches, or you shouldn't be unable to weight bear for a few, at week 6, for example. That would be an indication that there's something that we could have, like we're saying, you could have a chondral lesion, like the bone. You could have an avulsion fracture where something's come off, especially around the outside of your foot. It's very common, where a muscle called peroneus brevis attaches to the base of your fifth toe, and that's a very common area where people can have fractures that are often missed because you've got the swelling and all that sort of stuff, and people go straight to the ligament, but. There are often these other things that we could. So if it's not healing, that's another.
I would have thought. I guess when I think about any ankle sprains I've had, I feel as I've always recovered within a week, but it could be up to 4 weeks. Now here's another question for you on that one though. The longer you leave it, the more problematic that can be, or is this one of those things where if you do wait to see, if you realize you're not recovering as fast as you would have expected, have you lost any window of opportunity for more effective treatment by waiting?
There are some. There are some cases where, but if we if we said that, we would be talking about more the it'd be pretty serious. So you would have had a lot of bruising. You would have had a lot of swelling, and you've let that go. And
gotcha.
But often the little ones are. Yeah. Sorry, I was going to say often the little ones, like a grade 1 sprain or a grade 2 sprain, it's not going to be associated with a lot of those other things. But if it is a grade 2, for example, or a grade 3 where we've had some damage and we've missed a fracture or we've missed a chondral lesion, that can very quickly turn into something a little bit more sinister. Yeah.
Gotcha. So if it does, and I know we're talking about subjectivity here, so we want to be careful. But if it doesn't feel ridiculously painful and you didn't have huge amounts of swelling and bruising, probably, so we're not going to say anything definite here, probably you don't have anything that would be detrimental if you left it for too long. And if it was anything that needs immediate treatment, it's probably going to be so painful and it's going to be so visual that you're likely to thought, I need to go to the doctor anyway.
Yeah, and again, the probably the top of that list would be if you couldn't bear weight on it.
Yep. Yeah. So I guess that's a pretty good. That seems like you've said that a few times now. It's a pretty good indicator. Should we say if you can't bear weight or if you have trouble bearing weight?
If you can't bear weight, you definitely want to get that checked out. And that would warrant some further investigation as well. But if you're having trouble bearing weight or if you're unable, limping, like you're saying, if that keeps going, for a few weeks, it's not getting better, that sort of thing, regardless if there's, bruising or no bruising, typically that would be an indication that we would need to see go a little bit further. And the bigger reason there is, one is because things can get worse if you left them, obviously. But the other thing is you need to get back to functional movement as quickly as possible with things like this, because otherwise you're reducing the capacity of your ankle to move and bear weight, and your walking is going to be different. And then that's going to often cascade into some other things. So we want to get moving quickly. We want to get moving and weight bearing and functioning as normal as possible, as quickly as possible, but obviously not at the expense of, another structure causing further injury. So that's why we always say, okay, well, are you able to walk properly? Are you able to load properly? And when we're talking about walking, we're not saying just place your foot on the ground. We're talking about your regular heel toe walking. Yeah. Is your ankle able to go through its full range of motion and do its full function and bear weight and propel forward? If that's okay, then chances are you're going okay and everything's par for the course. If not, regardless of what it looks like and what it feels like, otherwise, we need to check out why that's not the case.
And it's always better to be safe than sorry.
Good.
Exactly. So how do we treat ankle sprain?
Yeah, so like we alluded to earlier, there's two distinct phases. One is the acute phase, where it's just happened in the next few days, the first week, that sort of thing. Now, typically, again, it comes down to how bad we think we've done it, and depending on the severity of the ankle sprain. If it's something that is, again, we can't bear weight, that sort of stuff, we're going to be trying to get off our foot, so non-weight bearing for a little while. They're the people that we see on crutches for a while and, just keeping it off the ground because you don't want to do any further damage. Or someone wearing a moon boot, something like that, where we're trying to protect the ankle, and keep it stable while we're investigating. So typically the first couple of days, if it's a grade 2 or grade 3, we often see people having some sort of restricted mobility with either crutches or a boot or something like that for a few days at least, or for a week. If it's just a grade 1 small tweak, within the first week, it should be good. Within 1 to 3 days even, you should be sort of back to almost normal level of activity. So that's the acute phase. And so while we're going through that phase, we definitely want to be reducing the inflammation in that phase. So icing, things like that, where you have an ice bath or an ice, a slushy or an ice pack or something like that, where you're trying to reduce the inflammation and you're trying to protect the ankle. So whether it's, like you said, strapping the ankle, which is a very low level stability measure, you can go up to, things like compression sleeves and ankle braces and things like that. But I'd typically like to see people in one of those sort of stability enhancing devices, whether it's strapping or a brace, pretty early on if we're not sure how we're going, because we don't want to damage anything further, especially if you haven't got it imaged. But you're just protecting that. And then if it's going par for the course, that's good. So that's the acute phase. And then, like we were saying, it's really important then to start rehabbing that ankle. And and getting back to functional movement as quickly as possible. And we do that through a series of things. One being functional exercise, stretching and strengthening, and movement, range of motion. So moving your ankle through its range of motion, using things like resistance bands and this is a segmented thing, and it really depends on where you're up to and what you're able to handle within the confines of what your ankle can do, and pain, of course. We want to try and use the things like resistance bands to try and like get that capacity back into the ankle and get it moving and get it able to load, bear weight and allow you to be back to heel toe walking, like we were saying.
Mm-hmm.
And then we go, the next step further is, you might not be ready to go back into activity yet, but you're able to walk. And then the next step is to get into more functional or sports specific exercises. And that would be things like, lunging and trying to change position and things like that, where you're squatting and you're able, because your ankle doesn't just move back and forward. Obviously, we want it to be able to move to, side to side. You've got to be able to, especially if you're playing a cutting sport where you're planting and you're moving,
mm-hmm.
your ankle's got to be able to do that. And also the one of the biggest things is retraining your balance or proprioception. And that's basically your body's ability to know where your ankle is in space or where your foot is in space, and be able to communicate your brain to your muscles to be able to keep everything stable. And they're things like where, I don't know if you've seen, Clint, people on wobble boards or people on an unstable surface where you're trying to train that balance. And basically you're trying to load the ankle, you're trying to have your weight on your ankle and be on your ankle for as long as we can, as stable as we can. So, making sure that, you can stand on one foot, weight bearing on one foot, but not being shaky and falling all over the place. That would really be stressing your ankle. And it's a really important thing, because often when we sprain our ankle, the physical damage is there, but we also damage these proprioception mechanisms. So we have these receptors that know where we are in space, and we've got to train the body and the mind sort of connection back to be able to get back into training and running, but not leave ourselves vulnerable to a recurrent ankle sprain, which is a very, very common thing. Once you've done one sprain, it's really common to re-sprain if we're not rehabbing that right.
That is very interesting, isn't it? So, And is that, I assume that the probability of that happening increases with the severity of the initial sprain as well?
Yes, and a deficit that you get in the proprioception. So if you're really struggling to stand on one foot, we typically get someone to stand up, and especially if you're standing and you've got your eyes open and you can't keep your balance, that's a pretty good sign that we need to really work on that, because and while we're working on that, we've got to stabilize the ankle. So, give it a little bit of support. And that's why people are being strapped when they return to sport initially. Even for the first 6 months or the first year, while we're building that deficit back up, we're eroding that and getting people's strength back up and proprioception back up, and ankle support, even if it's a dynamic sleeve or a plastic brace, or there are many things that we can use there, but essentially keeping them stable while we're trying to intrinsically improve their balance is a really important thing to consider, especially for somebody going back to sport. It might not matter for just walking in the street unless you hit a pothole or something like that, which would be unlucky. But playing sport where you're in these situations quite often, it's really, really important to not only do the physical rehab stuff, but also the balance stuff. That's
interesting. I guess that hadn't occurred to me, but so it's good that we know that there are some steps you go through to indicate as you're getting closer to that stage where your ankle, not just your ankle is recovered, but your ability to control your ankle and your balance and such has returned as well. And that's things like standing on one foot and with your eyes closed, or standing on a
just graded. Exactly. It's a graded program, and we things like that we include in our pain packs. Things like that where you buy an ankle sprain pain pack, and it'll take you through all those steps and use all the products you need. But also, it's not just the products you're using; it's also the exercises that you've got to do to bring your functional capacity back up to the level it needs to be, so that you're not just rushing back or going back on something which you think is okay, but functionally is really leaving you in a vulnerable situation.
Mm. Now, here's another question for you. How long does this normally take? You've sort of said like 1 week, where there's like sort of a certain period of recovery, and then you sort of said 4 weeks, and then up to 1 year. Obviously, they're sort of milestones.
Yes.
I guess how long until somebody says, should somebody be expecting for them to, I guess, no longer feel pain and be walking relatively normally?
Okay, yeah. So if it's a minor sprain, like a grade 1, something like that, within a week, we'd expect to be pretty much back to normal. Obviously, we can then rehab and get better, but we'd be expecting not to be limping in a week if it's a very minor sprain. So 1 to 3 weeks is our typical, sort of early stage estimation. But then it can be up to 4 to 6 weeks if it was like a higher grade sprain. Typically, unless it's a very unstable ankle where we're looking at, reconstructing that or something like that, typically we would say, around 6 weeks or so. Anything above that or anything after 6 weeks, 6 to 12 week mark, if we're still getting pain, we'd be looking at getting like something like a CT scan or an MRI to sort of help us clarify why we're still having some issues in that area. Because again, it could be something that was missed. The ligament might be okay, but there's something else that's going on that's stopping that person from, but to get total recovery, where we're saying, you're back to normal, if it's a high grade thing, 3 months is usually a good time frame. Anything 6 weeks, to 12 weeks, that's when I'd be starting to look a bit further if we're still struggling. And
as you're saying though, for like high level sports people, they could quite conceivably still be strapping their ankle for about a year or something, because they're just trying to get to that higher level of control and balance. And
it's all about risk assessment. Risk assessment, what activity you're doing, and particularly if you're at risk of having these inversion injuries again. So like I said, if we're just walking, if we're going back to the office or we're just playing a sport where it's one direction, forward, back, that sort of thing, it's a lot different than if we're trying to turn and trying to, step and cut and, load and move. And tennis, for example, things like that, tennis, basketball, where you're potentially landing on someone's foot even, that sort of thing, that would be a problem if we went back too soon and we just weren't ready.
Understood. So it's good to know. Now, you alluded earlier to pain packs and stuff that you do. Tell us a bit more about that. So this is, I guess, for somebody they've injured their ankle, they have somehow established, probably by seeing a medical practitioner, that it's not too serious. It's just a pain that they now need to deal with, which is going to last maybe a week to 3 weeks, if I remember.
1 to 3 weeks. Yep.
You've got some packs that can help manage that pain. Tell us about it.
We do, yes. So basically, because the ankle sprain is such a variable thing depending on the grading that we have, we have to, and like we said with the rehab, we have the acute phase where we've got to reduce the inflammation and keep it stable. But then we've also then got to, once we're strong enough, we've got to then build that capacity back up before we get into something. So we do that with a number of things. And the pain packs is basically or the ankle sprain pain packs in specific will be something that somebody can buy that gives them all the tools that they need to go through that phase. So your ice pack and your strapping and things like that, but also then we'll guide them through exercises and you'll have your resistance bands and talk you through a program or give you a program that you can follow using the equipment there. So it's all in one handy compartment for you, rather than you having to go and source each product individually and look things up online or ask this person or that person. This just gives you everything so that, especially for the early stage or the lower stages of ankle sprains, where you can self-rehab at home and just do that, knowing that this is the milestone I should be reaching, and then you can check that out. And if it's working well, that's great. If it's not, then we can then go and see somebody. Like we said, if something isn't progressing the way we think it should be progressing, then that's when we definitely should be seeking imaging or medical attention, physio, chiro, osteo, podiatrist, GP, whatever the case is.
Excellent. Yeah. And we'll share the URL at the end of the video. But just now, what is the URL that somebody can type in if they want to be able to purchase these pain packs?
The pain packs. Yes, it's painpacks.com.au.
Done. And we'll have that.
All one word.
Yep. Excellent. We'll have that at the end, and people will be able to get that if they so want. Thank you for your time, Sam. That was very interesting. I have
Pleasure.
to admit, I didn't expect ankle sprains to be quite that involved, but there's a lot more to them than I realized. And anytime I sprain my ankle in the future, I think I'm going to take it a bit more seriously than I have in the
Just
past.
come back and watch the video.
Yeah, I'll have to do that, and I'll probably end up going with the doctors anyway.
Yeah.
Thanks again for that, Sam. Take care.
Pleasure. Thanks, Clint.